On the morning of March 27, 1960, four young men climbed out of a battered car parked on a ranch road in Comal County, Texas. Hill country cut through with cedar and pale limestone, about 25 miles northeast of San Antonio. Orion Knox Jr., Preston Knodell, Al Brandt, and Joe Cantu were students at St. Mary's University, members of a caving club with more curiosity than equipment, and they were back for a fourth attempt at a rumor. Somewhere on the West family's cattle ranch, under a 60-foot slab of natural limestone that spanned a shallow amphitheater like a bridge no one had built, the ground was said to be hollow. Clara West Heidemann had given the students permission to look. 3 earlier trips down a narrow crawl space had produced nothing but scraped elbows and a stubborn hunch that the passage kept going somewhere. On this trip, Knox, the smallest of the four, was sent ahead into a gap choked with rubble, low enough that he had to exhale to fit through it. He felt a draft of cool air moving against his face, air with no obvious source. He kept crawling. Then there was no more rock to push against, no more ceiling pressing down, only darkness opening in every direction, and the sound of his own breathing filling a room none of them could see the edges of. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What Knox found that afternoon, and what his 3 friends followed him into within minutes, was not a single chamber. It was the mouth of a cave system that would eventually be surveyed at more than 2 miles of passage, cutting through 2 distinct geological layers beneath the ranch, the Glenrose Formation, which holds the Trinity Aquifer, and the harder Edwards Group limestone above it. The students had no professional equipment. They mapped what they found with a hand compass and a steel tape, a method Knox later called meticulous but primitive, and they returned again and again over the following weeks, widening their understanding of a space that kept refusing to end. One chamber, eventually named the Hall of the Mountain King, measured roughly 350 feet by 100 feet, the largest room in the system, its ceiling lost in shadow even under generator lights. Stalactites hung in columns thick enough to anchor a rope to. Flowstone had draped over older formations in sheets that took, by any reasonable geological estimate, tens of thousands of years to build one mineral layer at a time. The limestone bridge at the surface, the one that gave the site its name, was not a structure at all. It was what remained standing after an older sinkhole collapsed beneath it, a roof section that never fell, spanning open air over a system that had been quietly enlarging itself in the dark for longer than anyone standing on top of it that spring afternoon could have guessed. Later expeditions pushed into a second network they called the North Cavern, roughly 2 miles of additional passage, and one small chamber ended up named for the first 3 men to crawl into it: Jack Birch, Reggie Wurst, and Miles Kuykendall, their initials combined into a single label on a survey map that still marks the spot today. Soda straws, thin as drinking straws and just as hollow, hung from ceilings in places too tight for a grown man to stand upright. None of it was built. All of it was grown, mineral by mineral, drop by drop, in complete darkness, over a span of time longer than the whole of recorded Texas history several times over. Caves like this one do not appear at random. Karst landscapes form when rainwater, made faintly acidic by carbon dioxide absorbed from soil and air, seeps down through cracks in limestone bedrock and slowly dissolves the rock along those cracks, widening them over tens of thousands of years into channels, then rooms, then entire connected systems. The Edwards Plateau sits almost entirely on this kind of stone, which is also why it functions as one of the state's most important aquifer recharge zones. The same porous rock that grows caverns is the rock that lets rainfall disappear underground and resurface, sometimes miles away, in springs and rivers. A rancher standing on flat pastureland has no reliable way of knowing, without instruments or an accident, whether the ground beneath his boots is solid limestone or a thin shell over an empty room. Geologists who study the region describe the Edwards Plateau as one of the most cave-dense landscapes in North America. Thousands of documented voids, and almost certainly thousands more that have never been entered, spread across a limestone shelf that took shape roughly 100 million years ago when this part of Texas sat under a shallow inland sea. Everything discovered since, the caverns, the sinkholes, the burial sites, the bat colonies, has been sitting inside rock that was already old before the first mammal that could be called anything like a person walked across it. The cave was not empty of human history before the students arrived either, though that history stayed at the threshold rather than the depths. When the entrance trail was later cut and graded for public access, workers turned up arrowheads and spearheads in the disturbed soil, artifacts that archaeologists would date to roughly 5000 BC. Nobody has found evidence that the people who left those points ever went past the entrance into the crawl space Knox forced himself through in 1960. What the arrowheads confirm is narrower and in its way more unsettling. People had been standing at that exact spot on the Edwards Plateau, at the mouth of a hollow they likely never saw the inside of, for roughly 7,000 years before 4 college students with a steel tape measure finally went in. Commercial development of the site began on March 25, 1962, less than 2 years after the discovery, and Natural Bridge Caverns opened to the public on July 3, 1964. It was named a National Natural Landmark in 1971. Knox left college to help the Woost family prepare the cave for visitors, then went back later to earn an architecture degree at the University of Texas at Austin, selling his stake in the caverns in 1965. He kept caving on his own time regardless, which is how he met a fellow caver named Jan in 1967. They married and spent decades afterwards surveying cave systems across the Texas hill country together, measuring direction and slope in the dark, the same patient way Knox had learned as a student, compass and tape, one passage at a time. Knox died in late 2022. 6 decades after his 4th expedition, the cave he found was still not finished revealing itself. In May of 2019, a survey team working past the boundary of the original 1960 exploration broke into 600 feet of previously unrecorded passage, opening into a space with mineral-rich pools and crystalline mounds that had never been photographed or mapped. 60 years of tourism, 60 years of professional geological interest, and the system still had an edge nobody had reached. The caverns now run guided walking tours 7 days a week, along paved, lit paths through the Hall of the Mountain King and the Inferno Room, past formations tourists photograph, without necessarily grasping that the passage they are standing in did not exist, as far as any human record shows, until an architecture student held his breath and pushed through a gap barely wider than his shoulders. That is not, on reflection, especially surprising, because Natural Bridge Caverns sits inside something much larger than itself. The Edwards Plateau is a limestone region roughly the size of Ohio, sitting over the Edwards and Trinity aquifers, and it is riddled throughout with karst, sinkholes, blind valleys, water-cut caverns, and voids that never surface unless something forces them to. Ranch owners across a broad stretch of central and southwest Texas have spent generations working land they assumed was solid, because for most practical purposes it behaves as solid ground, right up until a fence post sinks farther than it should, or a draft of cold air comes out of a crack no wider than a boot, and somebody decides to go look. Natural Bridge Caverns is one of only 21 sites in the entire state recognized by the National Park Service as a National Natural Landmark, a list that also includes caverns of Sonora and Longhorn Cavern. Both of them show caves cut into the same belt of Edwards Plateau limestone. The plateau does not produce one cave and stop. It produces them the way a limestone shelf produces cracks, unevenly, unpredictably, and often only where somebody eventually notices. That pattern is not unique to the Ways Ranch. 84 years before Knox crawled into his discovery, in Edwards County, roughly 140 miles to the west, a rancher named Ammon Billings was leading a scouting party of 5 men west of Hackberry Creek when they encountered a band of Native Americans they took to be hostile. Billings fired a shot, believed he had hit someone, and the party retreated, fearing an ambush. They returned the next day, May 21, 1876, this time with their wives along, and it was on that second visit that Billings and the group came upon a gaping vertical shaft in the ground, an opening roughly 40 by 60 feet across that dropped straight down into darkness. His wife, Lucinda Catherine Billings, and the other women in the party gave it its name that same day, the Devil's Sinkhole. What they had found, without knowing the scale of it yet, was the largest single-chamber cavern in Texas, a pit that opens into an oval room some 320 feet across and drops roughly 350 feet below the surface, carved entirely by water dissolving the Edwards limestone over a span geologists place somewhere between 10,000 and 1,000,000 years. The earliest documented explorer after Billings carved his own name into the cave wall, along with a date, October 19, 1889, one line among what would become decades of names and initials left by cowboys, cavers, and curious ranch hands who climbed down to look. Archaeological evidence recovered from in and around the sinkhole, along with the oral traditions of the region's earlier inhabitants, points to something more deliberate than casual visitation. Sinkholes and caves across this part of Texas were widely regarded by native peoples as passages toward the underworld, and evidence at the Devil's Sinkhole suggests it may have served as a burial location long before any Anglo rancher ever stood at its rim. In the 1920s, workers rigged a rickety ladder down into the pit so that guano could be hauled out and sold as fertilizer, a use that continued sporadically for decades. 2 water-filled lake rooms deep inside the cavern have since been explored by divers to depths of 40 feet, and neither has been fully mapped. During the Second World War, the sinkhole's enormous bat colony drew the attention of a classified United States military program known as Project X-Ray, in which researchers experimented with fitting Mexican free-tailed bats with small incendiary devices, intending to release them over Japanese cities to start fires in wood and paper construction. Testing showed the concept had some effectiveness. It was never deployed in combat. The National Park Service designated the Devil's Sinkhole a National Natural Landmark in 1972. The state of Texas purchased the site and the 1,860 acres surrounding it in 1985 and opened it to limited, reservation-only public access in 1992. Today it is managed as a state natural area, its main attraction now the same colony of Mexican free-tailed bats, numbering in the millions, that pours out of the opening at dusk through the warmer months, indifferent to guano crews, wartime researchers, or whatever else the shaft below them has held across the centuries. The pattern holds a third time in Kerr County, on the eastern edge of the same plateau, at a site now known as the Bering Sinkhole. Sometime in the mid to late 1980s, the landowner was clearing the site with heavy equipment when the excavation began turning up human skulls, along with what was later identified as the spinal column of a wolf. He stopped work and contacted archaeologists at the University of Texas. What they eventually documented, layer by layer, was a natural limestone sinkhole on the Edwards Plateau that had been used as a burial ground by hunter-gatherers of the Llano River Basin for roughly 5,500 continuous years. The earliest interments radiocarbon dated to around 5000 BC. The excavation recovered the remains of 62 individuals alongside more than 25 species of animal bone, including bison, badger, armadillo, coyote, grey wolf, and domestic dog, plus artifacts worked from turtle shell, marine shell, antler, and stone. One burial preserved a rare and specific detail, a lithopedion, a calcified fetus that had never been delivered and instead mineralized inside the body of the woman who carried it, a condition modern medicine still considers exceptionally uncommon. For 55 centuries, generation after generation of people who left no writing and no monuments returned to that one hollow in the rock to bury their dead, and none of it was known to science until a rancher's bulldozer blade caught the edge of it by accident. The Bering Sinkhole sits within the same broad hydrogeologic system as the Devil's Sinkhole and the caverns under the Wooist Ranch, part of the network of solution cavities that the University of Texas and the Texas Historical Commission continue to document across the plateau through a public archive known as Texas Beyond History. What the excavation confirmed was not an isolated ritual site, but a place returned to, deliberately and repeatedly, across a span of time longer than the distance separating us from ancient Sumer. 3 sites, 3 counties across the same limestone plateau. 3 discoveries made not by institutions searching for something, but by ordinary people going about ordinary work. A ranch scouting party checking for trouble along a creek, a landowner clearing pasture, 4 broke college students chasing a rumor about a rock bridge. None of the 3 discoveries were planned research projects. None began with a grant application or a survey crew sent out to look for exactly this. In each case, what came up out of the ground once someone finally looked was older and more populated with human history than anyone standing at the opening that day had reason to expect. And in each case, the professional record only starts after the accident, after the shot fired at Hackberry Creek, after the bulldozer blade in Kerr County, after a college student ran out of rock to push against under a ranch in Comal County. Everything before that moment belongs to a much longer stretch of time that the plateau kept to itself, without effort, simply by being made of stone that does not readily give up what it is holding. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What these 3 openings share is not a secret kept by any agency or authority. Nothing here was suppressed. The records exist, the sites are documented, and in 2 of the 3 cases the public can walk in and see them for a fee or a reservation. What they share instead is a simpler and stranger fact about this particular stretch of Texas. The ground itself has been in continuous use for at least 7,000 years, by people whose names were never recorded, who left behind only stone points, shell ornaments, worked antler, and, in the case of the Bering Sinkhole, their own carefully placed dead, layer upon layer, in a hole in the rock their descendants kept returning to for longer than most written civilizations have existed. The Edwards Plateau was not empty before Ammon Billings, before the Woost family, before 4 kids with a steel tape. It was occupied, understood, and in at least one case, treated as sacred enough to be used as a cemetery across 200 generations. The written record of Texas begins, depending on how you count it, somewhere in the 15 and 1600s. The cast record underneath it runs back roughly 7,000 years further, and it was never hidden. It was simply underground, waiting on whoever happened to be standing in the right spot when the ground gave up enough of itself to be noticed. What survives of all 3 sites is still there to see, in one form or another. The Devil's Sinkhole still drops 350 feet into darkness northeast of Rock Springs, its walls still carrying the carved names of everyone from H.S. Barber in 1889 to the cowboys who followed him, its floor and lower chambers still largely unexcavated by professional archaeologists even now. The Bering Sinkhole's recovered remains and artifacts are held and studied by University of Texas researchers, documented through the state's archaeological record, a permanent account of 5,500 years that would otherwise have stayed entirely unknown. And Natural Bridge Caverns is open every day of the week, a paved path leading tourists past the Hall of the Mountain King and the Inferno Room, past formations that took longer to grow than the whole of human agriculture has existed, into a system that as recently as 2019 was still handing over passages nobody had ever walked through. Orion Knox spent the rest of his life connected to that cave, first as the college student who found it, later as the caver who kept mapping others like it alongside his wife, until his death in 2022 closed one small, specific chapter of a much larger and still unfinished survey. The Edwards Plateau underneath the Texas Hill Country remains, by any honest accounting, a limestone shell riddled with rooms nobody has entered, water systems nobody has traced to their source, and openings that have not yet found the person standing above them at the moment the ground decides to give way. Somewhere under a ranch that has never had a reason to suspect it, there is very likely another one, still sealed, still full of whatever water and time have left inside it, waiting on a rumor, a draft of cold air, and someone stubborn enough to keep crawling toward it. Knox spent his last working years still doing the same basic task he did as a 20-year-old in 1960, compass in one hand, tape in the other, moving through the dark a few feet at a time and writing down exactly what was there. It is not a fast method. It has never claimed to reveal everything at once. But across 60 years, 3 counties, and 1 limestone plateau, it is the only method that has ever actually worked. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.